Okay.
Record now. And so as with our other sessions, we recorded just the audio so that if you miss a class, then you can catch up that way. So we'll make it available to other members of the group, if that's all right.
Will you send it through like tomorrow or the day after or the week after?
Hopefully fairly soon. I mean, if I just click record now and I remember to finish it at the end, then hopefully, I haven't done it before, hopefully the file's not too big. And if so, we'll be able to put it on up on our website, but just limit it to access to this group, like we did with the other ones, with the audio. So hopefully as soon as possible, yes. Yes. Okay, so any other questions about the Zoom and all that technical stuff? Yes, Mary.
I haven't received direct emails. I've been receiving them via Maria, so it'd be nice if you do record it, if I can get the email with the recording.
Maria, the trouble with the booking system was you guys all booked together. And
Yeah.
so I didn't get separate email.
Maria send it.
So if you can send that through to me, I'll put you on the list and then you'll just get everything.
Okay.
Another problem we had, I think, was with one of this group anyway, the email didn't go through because I had too many links in it.
Press this to raise your hand.
Too many what?
Too many links in the email. And so some security systems on email servers say if there's more than 3 or 4 links in an email, it rejects it because they think it's spam. So that can be a problem.
Yeah.
So all right. So any other questions about the technology before we start?
Yes, just one comment. Bernie, is on the bottom right hand at the bottom of the screen on the right. There's a little square that says reactions, and when you say something great, we will do that. And,
no pressure.
Oh, is that like the worm?
or when we like, or at the end, if we've enjoyed it, we'll do this.
All right.
Oh, yeah.
Is there also a... we should
No.
do that one. Yeah. Okay. So, all right. Well, look, we'll make a start.
So can I just ask, the raise hand, what's that for? Is that if somebody wants to speak?
Oh, well, we won't use that. I think,
okay. All right.
I think basically we'll see how we go. We're a small enough group. I didn't want to make it too big. And actually, this is quite nice because it fits on my screen quite well. Yeah, when we get to the discussion, we can just, hopefully it'll all work all right. But you could even put your hand up on the screen, you know, that's we'll see how we go. We'll play it as it goes. All right. So I've got my notes up here, so I might look up here a bit every now and again. So because I certainly haven't learnt what I'm going to say about the Republic off by heart. But anyway, let's start. So welcome everyone. And for most of us, this is a continuing session from previous sessions. We've all done the introduction. And you may not think that you know much about Plato, but believe me, you've come a long way, not so much in terms of like a lot more content or anything, but more in kind of getting the idea of what Plato's about. You know, all that kind of turning around and looking from the other direction rather than looking to, in your knowing, towards the being of the material being of the object beyond your senses of it. It's going back the other way, going back to the formal essence of the being of the things that you know. Now, that sounds really crazy, doesn't it? But I think we sort of know what we mean. So it's Plato pointing up rather than, oh, I can't get my hand in, Aristotle pointing down, like in that famous painting in the Vatican. So, and we're not going to really assume too much more than you get having a bit of an idea of how kind of extraordinary from our point of view the Platonic view is. So we're going to go over the same sort of material, and the stuff we did in the first session, we're going to go over again, because a lot of that, the best teachings of the theory of forms and opposites and recollection, a lot of that is in the Republic. So don't be too worried about us getting too advanced. It is advanced, but it's advanced in the sense that you guys aren't going to be shocked by reading your Plato for the first time, which is difficult. So the book is big and it's difficult to read. So it wouldn't be a good idea for it to be the first dialogue that you read. But we're not going to read it all. We're just going to read small sections of it. And actually, we're going to leave a lot out, notably the first 4 books. And I'll explain as we go along why we'll just be focusing on particular sections. We have to focus because we don't have enough time to do the whole book, but there's good reasons for focusing on what we're focusing on. Now, you remember I said last time that translation doesn't really matter. You can have various translations, and I'm really hoping that, oh, hang on, I'll just turn my phone off. Translations, the translations don't really matter, but some people do feel a bit more comfortable when I'm reading the translation out or they're reading the same translation as other people. But it's kind of good to have different translations, because then you're aware that there is a problem with translation. But most people will be using the Penguin translation. There is a new Penguin translation, which we haven't got. They've got 2 for some reason. Someone in the group might have that. I'm not sure. Yeah, that's the old translation. There's Christopher Rowe translation in Penguin as well, which I haven't read. Okay, but it doesn't really matter. And I'll also be reading, sometimes when I'm reading out, I'll be reading a more literal.
Oh, I've got that one. Sorry. I've got Christopher Rowe.
Oh, well, that's great. That's the most recent.
Yeah, so do I.
I've got it on ebook.
That's great.
Yeah, so do I.
That's
I've
great.
got Christopher Rowe too, so.
Okay, that's really good. Okay, so that's the most recent Penguin. The rest of us, some of us might have Lee. I've got another one. I've got this one as well, which is it's a bit more literal in the Lerb edition, where they've got the Greek on the other side. Okay, so there we go. What we might do now is just quickly go around the room so that we meet everyone. And I will say again that I think my label might say my wife's name, because I'm using her lovely computer. Mine's a bit not quite up to the bill. So I'm actually Bernie Lewin. And I'll go around, and we can all just say our names and what your interest in the Republic is. You know, just anything particular. Why you're interested in reading Plato's Republic. Okay, so who wants to go first? Okay, what about Con? Con, because he's new to us.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Con. I'm actually a secondary school teacher. I've always been a big fan of the classics. I've always wanted to read Plato, but I've always wanted to do it with guidance. So that's why I decided to, and when I discovered the Platonic Academy and the email, and I said, yeah, this is what I need. I really place value on the classics, and as a teacher, I'm just a bit disillusioned that students today don't give a lot of value to the classics, don't read the classics, and just I can talk for hours. In the last 2 years, I've been a co-founder of a movement in Melbourne called Victorians for Classical Education. We've got a Facebook page, and we're just trying to bring the classics to schools. But when I say classical education, I've got to be careful. It doesn't just mean the books. Classical education is a big area.
Yeah. Okay, Con, that's great. Maybe you can tell me about that more after the
yeah,
session.
sure.
That's great. We'll just do a brief one now. Effie, you look like you're ready to go, and after that, I'll ask Mary. Effie.
Yep, I'm Effie. I got into Plato a few years ago. Why? I'm not really sure. Searching for truth, I guess, and discipline of mind, like just to think in a deeper way, basically, and to find truth.
Right. Okay, Mary, and then David.
Hi, I'm Mary Matrakis. I just love reading, and because of my Greek background, particularly the philosophers, I've had to go at reading it on my own, but this is obviously a good way to facilitate discussion about the meaning, which I'm sure I'll get more insight by participating.
Okay, thanks, Mary. David, and then after David, Martha. Yes, David?
Hello, I'm David. I helped out early this year with the introduction course. The Republic, I've tried to read it, but it seemed very big and kind of complicated or convoluted. So it'd be nice to hear some interpretations and different explanations from people.
Right. Okay, that's great. And hi,
Can
Mark.
I just ask, David, has that beard got bigger with the lockdown, or is that just my imagination?
I think it's kind of wrapped around my hair as become my beard.
It's looking very good, isn't it? We've already had a few comments about that. And Martha, I haven't said hello to you yet. How are you going, and what's your interest in Plato's Republic? Oh, no, we can't hear you, Martha.
Take off mute.
Take off mute.
Yeah. So I just want to continue what we started in the beginner's out. Sorry, my cat is biting me here. I have to move in. But yeah, just continue my curiosity and exploration.
Okay, that's great, Martha. Thanks. And Alexandra, do you want to come
out? I'm just interested to learn more about Plato's thought. I've tried to read the Republic myself, and I just found it too much of a challenge. So I'm hoping that, get a breakthrough with this seminar.
Great. Okay. All right. Thanks. And who have I missed now? I think, Pula, have we heard from you?
I haven't heard from me. I suppose I started backwards. I started with John Armstrong and Elaine de Botton. But the thing about John Armstrong was that he always, ended up in the classics. And that's where my interest started. And I read Ecce Homo and didn't understand a single word. And then I also read a lot of Kazantzakis, who, I fell in love with, and worked backwards to Plato and Aristotle.
Oh, that's great. That's great. And I think we've got Hume and Maria left. I think that's it there on the same screen. So you guys want to go?
Hi everyone, I'm Maria. Both Hume and I come from the other side of things. We're both scientists. But I did, talking about classical education, I did my secondary education in Athens, and we had to study Plato, or certain books of Plato in ancient Greek. and that was really great, but there was not, I mean, the emphasis was on the language and the syntax rather than on the meaning and the actual text. I thoroughly enjoyed the last days of Socrates with Bernie and the team, and I'm really looking forward to starting this, because the Republic is difficult, so it's great to be doing it in all together, and to ask questions and have discussions. And I'm really interested in what you just said, Bernie, that trying, you know, to read the passages and get more of an insight into particularly into the forms and the soul and things that we discussed last year, or
this year.
Last, oh, oh my God, okay.
It feels like another time before COVID, doesn't it? Mm. Okay, and Hume, did you want to say anything extra to that?
No, not really. I just want to continue trying to comprehend what the hell we're reading. I rely on your good judgment as to what's appropriate to pick out each week and go through and to help me make sense of it. But I do enjoy it.
Okay, well, that's great. So what we will be picking out is nothing particularly extraordinary in terms of my selection. We are picking out the greatest hits, the stuff that's shown the most interest, attracted the most interest over the millennia. I mean, it is, we are about to read one of the greatest books in our tradition, and one of the books that is very much not only at the foundation of philosophy, but in the foundation of the whole Western tradition and Western culture. So it's very exciting to do this. In the Academy, in one of our earlier sessions, in our first, in fact, session, in 2019, we did cover the Republic a little bit, but not as a dedicated class to it. So this is the first time, and it is by popular demand. There's a number of people I can see here who pretty much demanded this class. So I went back and studied it, read it, and pulled some stuff out for you guys. And so I hope you really enjoy it. Now, the structure of what we're going to do might be a bit different online, and I reckon we might run out of a bit of time here today, so we'll just see how we go. Because today we've done this introduction and we're already almost half an hour through. But the two extra things that I need to do is introduce the Republic first, and then also what I want to do is go all the way through the narrative of the Republic. So we'll be doing the reading, but I'll introduce the narrative up to the reading, and then we'll focus on the reading, and then then for the next reading, I'll bridge it. So you get a sense of the entire Republic, including the bits that we won't be reading and the bits that often are rarely read as well. So you get a bit of a sense of the narrative. Some people probably think the narrative isn't so important, but you will get a sense of that. So you can see where what you're reading fits into the big picture. Because very often people might know the allegory of the cave or whatever, but not really understand how that fits in with everything else in the Republic. So today I'll give the introduction to the Republic first, and then I'll need to do that, the first 4 books, and I'll explain why it's first 4 books. And so we'll just see how we go. Hopefully we'll get to the reading and there'll be plenty of time for discussion of the reading. So we'll break after the first 4 books, and then we'll break after for discussion of the actual reading. Okay, so we'll see how we go. We can't really do a tea break. We can't do a tea break, I suppose, or maybe we can, you know, and just have general chatter and people can go and get a cup of tea. I don't know. All right. How's that all sound?
Yeah.
Yeah, good.
All right. So I'll start just giving you the general introduction to the Republic, and let's see if I can share the screen. Wait a minute, share screen, and share, and let me see if I can get the slideshow.
Yeah.
Got it.
Perfect.
Does it come up?
Yes.
Yeah.
It
Oh, wait a
did,
minute.
and then
It's
it's gone.
disappeared.
Okay.
It's back. It's
All
back.
right, it's
Yeah.
up? All
Yep.
right. Okay. So,
Sorry.
firstly, the Republic is where it fits in with the dialogue. So there is a real chronology in the dialogues, like a development of Plato's work. And so people traditionally put them into these categories of early, middle, and late. And the Republic is very much in the middle period. In fact, it's towards the end of the middle period. So it's a reasonably mature sort of, hang on, here it is. It's a reasonably mature sort of dialogue. So the early dialogues, do we remember Euthyphro? Do you remember how it was an inconclusive dialogue, a discussion between Socrates and someone else, Euthyphro, who was a theologian, and they were discussing impiety or piety, and then they were discussing what is justice. And at the end, it kind of just finishes and it's inconclusive. So that's fairly typical of the early ones. And there's Socratic dialogue, so there's always Socrates as the main character, sort of leading the dialogue, although he's always claiming that he isn't. In the middle period, it's still Socrates who's the leader, but it tends to be more preachy. There's still the dialogue, but it tends to kind of be pushing a bit of an argument. So we've already done the Phaedo, that's from the middle period. And there's another class that we'll be offering in 8 weeks' time, which is includes a symposium, and that's also from the middle period. So the Republic's quite late in the middle period, and this is where he introduces recollection, knowledge as recollection, very much that opposite stuff. Remember, we're doing that stuff about the opposites and how, you know, the one and the not one and all that sort of thing. Yeah, so the Phaedo comes before the Republic, so it's much more mature, and the theory of forms is most developed in the Republic more than perhaps anywhere else. And then in the late period, it's not Socrates actually talking a lot of the times, or he might be there, but he's not leading. And so some of these later dialogues are notoriously difficult, especially the Parmenides. And I hope one day to be able to teach the Parmenides and the Sophist, which is another related dialogue from this period. One dialogue from the late period that you might have heard of before is the Timaeus, which gives kind of a cosmology and astronomy, if you like, and a creation of the world myth and all that. And that was very important in the Christian Middle Ages. It was the key Platonic text, and it really influenced thinking in the Middle Ages. Okay, so that's where it fits in. Now, the table, okay, so what else have we got here? Okay, so the title of the Republic is Politia, coming from polis, and really refers to the city-state. So that was the main organization in ancient Greece, political organization, the various city-states, which Athens was one of them. But but the reference here is not so much to the government, but more broadly to the social organization. So it's referring to the way society is organized, even its culture, as well as the government. And you'll see that in the book. It is very much about culture. So what is a republic about? It's a utopian project. It's a dialogue as a utopian project, an imaginary creation of a Kallipolis, a beautiful, fine city. And it's the first utopia in our tradition. So it's the first time someone tried to imagine what a good society would be like and then built it in this way. And so that is a tradition, that's a genre of writing that has been very important in the Western tradition for a long time. And the actual name utopia for this genre of writing is quite interesting. It comes from Thomas More, who was a British thinker in the Reformation time, a friend of Erasmus, and a translator, a reader and translator of ancient Greek. He did some first translations of some ancient Greeks, not Plato, but others. So he wrote Utopia, which means literally in the Greek, nowhere land, if you like, the place from nowhere. And so it's in the sense imaginary. So it's quite an appropriate word to use. And also a famous utopia came a bit later, again in Britain, and that was Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, which has lots of references to Plato, the Atlantis for a start, and it's and it was also very influential because the House of Solomon that is depicted in New Atlantis was the model for the Royal Society of London, and then subsequently for all scientific societies that developed in the Enlightenment. So there is this long tradition that that emerged out from starting with the Republic. Now, the subtitle of the Republic is on justice, and this was applied retrospectively, but justifiably, because the narrative of the whole idea of the Republic comes out in the narrative from a discussion of the good society, the just society. And so the first question that comes up is, what is justice? And then move from that to a just society. We'll explain how that happens. So we remember that justice is a big theme in Plato's writing. Of course, in relation to Socrates and him being his hero being killed by the state, was that just? And we see it in the writings in Euthyphro. It starts off with what is piety. When we read that, I'm referring a bit to what we read in the previous class, so you'll probably have to just, skip a bit there. And that moved to what is justice. So a lot of the discussions move to what is justice in the individual, because their name Dikos has this kind of sense of the justice or the harmony in the individual, as well as the justice of the society. And the justice of the society in the Republic is very much how we think of justice, a just and just society, the justice system and all that sort of thing. That's really what Republic's all about. So how does Plato connect them? And there's a quote which comes a bit later after he started, which says, "We set about founding an ideal state, being sure we should find justice in it because it was good." So it's about public justice and what public justice means. So it's a utopia. It's a utopia for what is the good life, what is a happy life for all. But this is not the only reason people read the Republic. In fact, some people don't really pay attention to that much at all. And so there are other interpretations and there are other layers of meaning. Some of them quite apparent and some of them quite deep. And we'll be addressing some of these. But the most important thing to say is that some people just read the Republic in this section, the education of the philosophers, for Plato's positive philosophy. So his theory of forms and the allegory of the cave, which a lot of people know about, is one of the most famous expressions or images of his theory of forms. And that's stuff we've been talking about earlier, where we were saying that sensible things are shadowy expressions of their formal essence. And that's very much expressed in the allegory of the cave, which we'll come to. So how's everyone going with that so far?
Good, good.
Good, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good.
Good.
All right. So now the structure of the book, and I'll explain a bit what the structure is and where the emphasis is in the reading. So, because in fact, a lot of people don't read the first few books. And for the first reading, I'd probably dissuade you to do that. So absolutely encourage you to read the whole book, but it's a bit like maybe reading the Bible or something. Maybe you want to start somewhere other than Genesis. Read straight through. Maybe you want to pick out. And the same with the Republic, I think. Okay. So some people actually speculate. It's a very long dialogue and it's actually written in, it's actually been divided up into 10 books. And this division is not Plato's, of course. He didn't write in books. It was published on tablets. Well, actually, not actually so sure about how it was published, but certainly not in books. And sometimes the division into the books is arbitrary. Sometimes it fits in well with the subject matter and the turns of the conversation, but often it's arbitrary. And so you'll probably notice if you've got the Penguin edition or some other editions, they ignore or suppress the division into the books, and then they put in their own sections. And that's quite helpful. That's totally fine. But I'll stick to the division of the books because that's orientate to. Now, there is the thought that some parts of the Republic were earlier versions were published separately as separate dialogues, and there's certainly the feeling of this in Book 1, which is an inconclusive dialogue on justice in the person, and it's back referenced as a prelude to the main discussion of the Republic. So this is the old Socratic style, like in Euthyphro. If you go and read that, it's a good one to read in itself. Then you'll see that it's similar style to Euthyphro and the earlier dialogues. Now, in Book 2 begins the project of building a city that is just. And so they start building that. And then in Book 3, a very important theme is introduced, which is the theme of education, that education is really important for the Republic. And this is where Plato famously criticizes traditional education, which is based in poetry, the poetry of Homer and Hesiod mainly. And so Plato's criticism of poetry and his wanting to at least limit its role in the Republic is notorious amongst artists, including some of my friends who refuse to read Plato because of Book 4 introduces these psychosocial things. So sort of like this, what's going on psychologically in the mind and sociological. So linking the sociological and the psychological. And this is where we start in our discussion. And so that's why I've got it highlighted here. And it also has discussion of the role of the family and of women, and his discussion of women who were generally were invisible in public society. Plato had a very different view, and that's quite famous too. Now then you get to the real gems, the real magical stuff that people get very excited about. From book 5 and book 6, you go into the allegorical section, where Plato introduces his higher mystical philosophy. So this is where he introduces the notion of the form of the good, and how you imagine the form of the good as the highest form and how it influences all the other forms. So he uses various allegories there, mainly based around the idea of the sun and sunlight. And then book 7 starts with the famous allegory of the cave, which continues this allegory of light and sunlight for the mind's eye, the physical eye and the mind's eye seeing in different ways. Book 7 also has the education program. So he's got rid of poetry as the basis of education and introduced this program, which is probably more familiar to us, which is a focus on the mathematical sciences, and then the very important role of dialectic, as in dialogue, but with a very specific meaning, quite a specific meaning. Okay. Another fairly famous section. So this is all, that was all philosophical there, and that's all, there's interest in that because it's philosophical. It's expounding Plato's philosophical view, and it's a view that then was very important right through Platonism in the ancient times, and then in the Christian Platonism and Islamic Platonism as well. But in book 8, he discusses different forms of government. So we're getting now back to the political. And he describes it in terms of a degeneracy of government from a kingdom, perhaps from a good kingdom like a kingdom run by philosopher kings, and that it devolves, it degenerates and devolves down into democracy, which is the second lowest form of government, and the seeds of tyranny emerge within democracy. So that's a very interesting discussion in these times. And in book 9, he focuses in on tyranny and how it emerges out of democracy. Oh my God, it's frightening to read right now.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So, and then the final book my artistic friends will not read, which is where it goes in harder against art and representational art. And he says, well, you know, like, it's all very well, but we don't want this sort of art. He's got this specific sorts of art in mind. We don't want this in our republic because it'll just corrupt it. So, it's kind of like a defense of what he said earlier in brief, but he goes in even harder. So that's quite funny. And then finally we finish with something that Effie mentioned to me last time, which I hadn't paid much attention to and is not on our reading. I'm sorry, Effie, but we could.
I noticed.
Yeah. So it's this final myth of which has lots of imagery in it, which is really fascinating, and it's an imagination of the afterlife of the soul and the immortality of the soul. So so that's the structure of the book. So is that any questions on that?
I have a question, if I may.
Yeah.
I obviously haven't read book 3 and 10 about the arts, but is it absolutely clear that he's against the representational arts, or was it that representational arts at the time were to do with gods, and Homer and Hesiod really talked about the gods a fair bit. Was that the problem, or was it just the representational arts? Because they were pretty specific back then, the representational arts.
That's right. That was the target. And I'll get into that in a moment when I start summarizing that section. That was certainly the target. And the way the gods are treated, the way these stories, these kind of myths and which he sees as quite nasty myths about the gods, because actually the gods are good and they're telling all these, you know, tales about the gods where they're angry and embittered and they punish people and fight other gods and that sort of thing. So yeah, that's what he was attacking. Yeah, his solution, you know, well, you know, we'll look at that. Yeah. Anyone else? Okay. All right. So, so just as a summary, then, so why have we chosen what we've chosen? Well, there's the philosophical interest is one of the main interests of the book, probably more so than the outline of the Republic. There's lots of the people who get into the Republic stuff, the outline of the Republic, are often those who want to criticize it and criticize Plato, and it's very easy to, as you'll see as I summarize it. You know, some people depict it as this totalitarian state with very little freedom and so on. So, but the philosophical interest is really in the expounding of his philosophy in book 5 to 7. The political interest that has endured is these different types of imperfect society that he talks about in book 8, talking about the certain regimes that you would have, say, in democracy or in tyranny or in a kingdom or whatever, and how bad practices start to emerge, get encouraged and start to emerge, and then the society degenerates and degenerates. So it's an interesting discussion. I mean, you don't have to agree with him, but I think it's quite an interesting style of discussion and brings up lots of issues for debate. And then there are the other specialist interests. So I didn't put in the discussion of women and their role because there's not any great reading in there, but I can summarize it, and other people might be able to summarize it better. It certainly isn't modern feminism, but it was certainly revolutionary at the time. And then there's things like the myth of which has a specific interest to try to interpret that. So we can discuss these things as we go. As we get to that stage, I'm going to do the summary, and in the summary we can go into more detail. And I'm quite happy to point people to the sections. If you've got the Penguin edition, you should be able to find them fairly easily, and you could do that reading as well in the week that we're going to approach it, because I'll be summarizing the whole book as we go. All right, so okay, so are we ready for the summary of the first 4 books?
Yep.
Okay, all right. So we are at the port of Athens. Piraeus. Sorry, folks, I have to, how many Greeks have we got here? We're nearly all.
I think you're outnumbered, Bernie.
Yeah. I'm going to say Psyche, not try and say Psyche. I'm sorry, but you all understand what I mean.
Yep.
Okay, so we're at the port. It's outside Athens. We're in the house of a wealthy non-citizen during a festival to a foreign god. So there's some sort of sense that Plato's trying to set the scene as separate from Athens, and perhaps separate from Athens' democracy. And we can see why, or we've already suggested why previously, yeah. So the characters are Socrates, he's leading, and then there's this sophist called Thrasymachus, who's a sophist, who aggressively challenges Socrates in book 1. So remember, book 1 is this conventional style dialogue like from the early period. But after that, in book 2, there's this flip into Socrates dominating the discussion, and very much it's an exposition. And the other players just tend to go along with it, which some people find annoying. Now, these players are actually Adamantus and Glaucon. Now, these two names would have been recognizable in Plato's time as the names of Plato's brothers. So the two people Socrates is talking to, especially Glaucon, most of the time in the second half, in the main text, is recognizably as Socrates' brother, Plato's brother. So I don't know why that is. Okay. So the discussion opens when Socrates is walking along the street and playfully dragged into the house of this old, rich, foreign patriarch. And in the discussion quickly evolves into Socrates asking him, what's it like to be old? And this chap says, well, it's not so bad. But he raises concern that when you get old, you get a bit worried about stories about the afterlife and all this retribution that you might get for injustices that you committed during your life. And so this brings up the question, what is justice? So he's quickly pushed it into this question. And in the first book, the first definition that he brings up just casually is to give everyone back what they owe. And but then it says, well, this can't really be right, because what if your friend would you give back your weapon to a friend who was mad, who had gone mad? And then maybe it's telling the truth, but sometimes it's not a good idea to tell the truth in certain circumstances. So there must be a deeper meaning of justice. So what exactly is justice? So it comes up with a second definition, a more solid one. Justice is to do good to one's friends and harm to your enemies. Okay, and this is on page 332D. So I think everyone knows we're using standard pagination, just if you wanted to look it up later. Socrates defends this in his usual question and answer way. But then Thrasymachus attacks him for feigning ignorance and ironic evasion. So here, Plato puts in, remember we're reading a play, it's not all Socrates, Plato puts in a very strong criticism of the Socratic method that's been used in his earlier works. So that's very interesting to read. And if you want to look later on page 336 plus onwards, yeah, page 336. Okay, so now Thrasymachus, who is attacking really hard, he's attacking the method, and then he says, well, actually, you know what justice is? Justice is all in the interests of the rich and the powerful. So it's really, what he's saying is that the powerful people in society determine what's just and unjust as a kind of dogma that serves their interests. So some people might have heard this since in, say, a left-wing critique of religion or something, where church morality serves the interests of the elite. You know, this is sort of that sort of thing, or the Marxist idea of bourgeois ideology. So, you know, it's where there's a certain idea of just and unjust, which serves the interests of the powerful. So this is the argument that the sophist is putting forward. And so they argue about that a bit, and then Thrasymachus remains aggressive towards Socrates, but changes Socratic style and then says, well, actually, it is more profitable to be unjust than to be just. So this is kind of a new argument from a personal side of things. It's like, if you cheat, you win. You know, cheats always win. Those people that just stay just, they're losers. So the unjust have a better life. So we've heard that argument before, since, I should say. Okay, so Socrates argues against this, and this is now introducing some of the big themes when we're moving towards the ideal society. He introduces the importance of cooperation. Socrates argues back that for humans to achieve anything, actually, cooperation is required. There's very little that you can achieve that's worth anything that you can't achieve without some sort of cooperation. And so there must be justice in the society to allow that cooperation. Justice provides the possibility to achieve the common good together. Achieving the common good achieves the good for all the individuals. And he uses a systems analogy here, which is really the system of the human body. So systems work well if their parts do the job properly. It's like the human body. If all the parts do their own function properly, then the whole system works properly and it's better for all the parts. So then he talks about the function of the psyche. So we're getting back to the mind and the individual. And he says the function of the psyche is to live well, which means, in this case, to live justly. And Thrasymachus reluctantly concedes the debate that Socrates technically wins. So he's kind of silenced. It's sort of like, yeah, you're right. And everyone sort of goes, yeah, you're right, I suppose. But Glaucon, so he's not so oppositional, Glaucon. He's very supportive, in fact, really pretty much airs what everyone else is feeling, which is, well, we're not really convinced by your argument. And we really think that Thrasymachus didn't really make the argument very strongly. So I'm now going to make that argument. And I'm going to make a really strong argument. And the way he makes the argument is to argue in terms of justice being of value in itself to the individual and not in terms of its consequences. And what he means by this is this, well, he sets an example here. He says, well, look, okay, here's an extreme case. What if you're a perfectly just person, but you have the appearance of being unjust? Then you will get none of the social benefit of being just because you appear to be unjust. So would that be good for you to appear to be just and to appear unjust? And then he does the vice versa, which is what he argues for and wants Socrates to argue against. That is better to be unjust and appear just. What if you could have the reputation for justice, but underneath you're completely unjust? And this is what Glaucon argues for. So he does this sophistic argument for that case. And that sets up Socrates' answer. And Socrates' answer is, he says, to show that justice has intrinsic and not only consequential value, he's now going to introduce justice in a different way. Think about justice in a different way. So we will remember that with justice, it has this it's not specifically about society, but Socrates here wants to broaden it to society. He wants to say, okay, let's look at justice writ large. Let's look at the big picture for justice, and then we can see what justice is in itself and for the individual. And what he means by writ large is in an ideal society. So to explain what is just in the individual, Socrates wants to first show it writ large in the city. In this way, he will show us what it is in itself and in the individual. So it's a social argument, and this brings in the opportunity to build his hypothetical state, his utopia. A state comes into being here in theory, as he says, and he's building a theoretical state from scratch. So here starts the building of the state. How are we going? Any questions about that? No? Okay. Let me stop scaring. Oh, wait a minute. Okay, sorry, I just had a hiccup on my my Zoom there. Okay, so yeah, okay, so I'll continue with that then. So the big thing about his state is specialization and cooperation, and he starts basically saying you need a tinker, tailor, soldier, sailor, and you need these people to be specialized. So they're not doing different jobs. They're all doing their own job, doing it well, and they have mutual dependence on each other. So that is really...
Excuse me, Bernie, we lost you. We don't have any visual.
Oh, okay.
I can see you.
I've got visual.
Oh, okay.
Oh.
I have two.
Then continue, we'll find it.
Okay, we'll continue. Okay, so it's this mutual dependence, this specialization, which he is really encouraging. And one of the specializations is a professional army. And so it's really strange that the professional army is what the focus is on for the rest of the time. It's, I suppose it's not really an army, but they are professional soldiers and defenders of the state, which is usually translated as guardians. So the guardians defend the state, and they're also the ruling class. This is an important development in the narrative here. So they defend the state externally because they're the military, and internally through government. So government defends the internal constitution of the state, but it's in one person, in one role in the society. Now, the selection of these rulers is important because they need to be gentle, they need to be high-spirited and passionate about knowledge and wisdom, because as we'll see, knowledge and wisdom is really important because on that basis you govern the society. This balance of attributes is hard to find. I mean, the soldier type and the philosopher type are rarely in one person. So you need to select carefully, but education is also important. So here comes the importance of education in his society. Okay, and his criticism of traditional education. So traditional education, I'll just give a bit of an explanation of that so we can really understand it. It was, so there was the professional education, which is, you know, if you're going to be a tinker, tailor, sailor, smithy, whatever else, we're educated for that. But there was also physical education and cultural education. Now, the physical education for men was, or boys, I should say, was this gymnasium, working out in the gymnasium, which was highly ritualized with exercising naked, anointing with oil afterwards, and so forth. And so this was all part of the warrior culture of Greek culture, which was more pronounced perhaps in Sparta, but it was very strong in Athens as well. And related to to that culture was a real culture of fitness, with like the Olympic Games, and champions of the Olympic Games were absolutely lauded throughout their lives. So a real strong focus on that. But what he's more interested in and what he thinks is more important is cultural education. And the current cultural education was focused on learning the great poems, the poems of Homer and Hesiod in particular. So, and interestingly enough, again with the language, this education, we might say like arts, like you do an arts degree, but this education was collected under what we now, under music or musiki, or however Maria might pronounce it for me there.
Musiki.
Musiki. So poetry was actually considered music. In fact, it was you know, very much a part of music, and in the broad sense, all the arts were known as classed under this category called music. So this education was reading the poets and learning from the poets, from the stories, a bit like perhaps reading the Old Testament. I think that's what I like to compare it with. So why did Plato reject it? He rejected it because, mainly because they promoted false stories about gods that modeled bad behavior. False stories about gods that modeled bad behavior. So impressionable young people were reading these stories of wild, violent behavior, immoral behavior by gods who were angry, spiteful, and gave bad examples. But also the stories, slightly controversially, Socrates says are untrue. So these are untrue fables about the gods, and we should stop telling them. And even if they're allegorically true, we should stop telling them to the youth, because they won't understand the deeper meaning, just getting the superficial meaning, and that can be very destructive. It also has horror stories of the afterlife. So getting back to the beginning of the dialogue, where you're worried about the afterlife. And this is bad for society because it would mitigate against bravery in the war. If you're worried about dying, then you know, you won't risk your death in war. But then he also criticizes, and this comes more in book 10, and this relates to what Effie was saying. He criticizes the imitative arts, which is like plays and so the plays that were put on in Athens and in Greece in general, and also the play acting of the poems. So you used to have the rhapsody poets actually acting all the parts. And this is bad because when you imitate, you tend to take on those characters, and that is a problem, especially if they're evil characters. But his criticism of the imitative arts, the criticism of plays and poems who have characters, immediately starts you thinking, well, what exactly am I reading here? Aren't I reading a bit of a play where in the dialogues where the Plato is, you know, got these characters, Socrates and so on. So where does the self-contradiction fit in there? I don't know. Okay, but he's
Benny,
yeah.
What talking about the mainstream education?
Yeah.
What about oratory, like rhetoric and debating? What was Plato criticizing those forms of? Because that was part of mainstream education, wasn't it? I mean, if you wanted to go anywhere, you needed to be able to express yourself, be articulate, convey your message well, and bring others to your conclusions, to see things as you are.
Yeah, that's a good point, Maria. And as we know, he criticized that in other dialogues, and the criticism of the sophists and the teachers of rhetoric, that it was all about persuasion and orientated to people towards persuasion rather than trying to find the truth. And so that was in the Senate and in the courts. Rhetoric was taught in that way. So actually, I don't think this comes up here. It doesn't really come up here. So yes, he criticizes that elsewhere, but he's particularly focusing on this cultural education rather than the teaching of rhetoric. But what does he want to have in its place?
So, excuse me, Bernie, what aspects of music in general does he favor? Because he emphasizes it must be music and gymnastics.
Yes.
To promote the health of the soul and the body. So what are the positive, if he doesn't like a lot of the representational arts, what part of the arts and music does he favor?
Well, in this section, and so I'll focus on the argument in this section, he actually says you can do it, but you have to do it like propaganda, basically. So it's okay. In some cases, it's not good to be false, but in other cases, it is good to be false. And one of the ways it's good to be false is to tell good legends about the gods, because the gods are essentially good. So you tell stories about the gods, you've got to tell stories where the gods are good. And so later on, he calls these noble lies. And so you tell noble lies to the people. I mean, we might be thinking, I'm thinking of Biggles here in the British Empire, and then I'm thinking of also Soviet propaganda. But you tell these stories in order to unite the society and to educate your youth into feeling good about society and good about the gods. So,
but as a substantive education, like curriculum, or what falls under music then, in that he would feel it's very important for the soul, as gymnastics are for the body?
It would be poetry. You compose poetry and songs that have the right themes and are uplifting for the soul. So he doesn't like laments and dirges because they don't uplift the soul.
And his comment about they should not be altered, the curriculum should never be altered, just in the short section that I've read, that sounded very rigid.
Yes, it's very rigid. Yeah. So one of the stories he gets, oh, okay, so I should say also that to a large extent he wants to get rid of this education and later on replace it with a completely different education, right? So there still is these stories, the propaganda, but the big move in the Republic is to have the scientific education starting with, which we discussed in the previous thing, the number one, and arithmetic, and geometry of the plane, and then geometry of the solids, and then astronomy, and so on. So the mathematical sciences, and dialectic, which is not so much rhetoric, but it's a way of searching for the truth. So rhetoric's about persuading people, dialectic's about finding the truth-free discussion. He makes a very strong distinction there. So is that help, Martha?
Yes, because just in the short section I read, it was focused on just keeping that part of the music and not changing it. But from what I gather, from what you said, that evolves later into expanding it into other areas. Yeah. Just keeping the good part of it in a narrow sense.
Yes.
And then adding in the mathematics and real sciences.
Yes.
But just in that particular book, the emphasis is just on a rigid keeping of the status quo.
Yes. Yes.
Without qualification in this book, but I haven't read any further.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh no! Look, definitely, it's a very rigid society, and it's highly controlled by these philosopher kings at the top. So there's no doubt about that. You know, if you're reading it that way, that is correct. Okay, so I'm just looking at the time. What do we want to do? We've got 15 minutes to go. Did anyone want to ask any more questions about that?
May I have some clarification?
Yeah.
In regards to the false stories about the gods encouraging bad behavior,
Yeah.
Socrates was put to death because he encouraged bad behavior. And that, can you just remind me what happened there? Like,
Socrates
he was
misleading the youth, and
but he had something to do with the gods, right?
Yeah,
like,
what do you say? Discouraging belief in the traditional gods, if you like. Yeah, I can't remember the wording.
Right.
And so here one could argue that he was. So these stories about the gods in the poems, as I understand it, you didn't have to believe them. You didn't really, it wasn't that important to believe them so much, but you did have to go through the ritual practices about the religion. That was important. So to a certain extent, some people could pull him up on saying all these stories about the gods are false. And so he's encouraging irreligion. But you could also make an argument, if you're on his side, is that he's just saying, well, these are bad stories about the gods and we shouldn't encourage them. I'm not against believing in the gods.
Can I just say, it sort of reminds me of all religions, that he's saying you can't just believe something because the story is made up about it. You've got to search for the truth. And,
yeah.
And he believes in an education where you just don't convey dogma or stories. You teach people to inquire, something like that. Is that?
Well, that's certainly the case when we get to the dialectic. Yes, it's teaching inquiry, and you've got to have the right attitude. It's not about winning the argument. It's about working together to try to find the truth. So he's certainly encouraging that, and generally he's encouraging that. But when he's setting up this republic, what's he doing? I mean, to a certain extent, he's kind of treating the plebeians, the workers in society. So I should explain that now. I mean, we haven't got to it, but we're obviously running out of time. But so the structure of the society was the guardians and the people all doing their trades. Everyone does their own trade. And he starts to divide the guardians between the rulers and the auxiliaries. So the guardians and the auxiliaries, initially they're both the same. So the guardians are very much the philosophers who have the big education, and the auxiliaries are more the military people living in barracks and so on. And then there's the society itself. And so there's this very strong sense that, like, it's okay to tell lies to the society. It's okay to invent these myths so that people behave well, because we know what's good for them.
I suppose it is for the plebeians then, isn't it? Because the plebeians don't have the education perhaps that the elite might have. So it's a way of conveying a message to the plebeians and having some structure to your society as a consequence, some mores, some rules, so that you don't have complete, I don't know, anarchy or people doing what they think is right and it's not.
Yeah.
If the plebeians don't have the education, they're still streetwise, and they can still work things out. And there is and still have a sense of justice or injustice. What I'm interested to know is, you know, in the ancient plays, you know, Sophocles and Euripides, the gods referred to they're very, very human, but they're sort of, the plays are teaching people to see the behavior of gods and see themselves and in these behaviors. So they're sort of, the gods are made in the people's image, I suppose you could say. What was it about that aspect that maybe Plato and Socrates, you know, sort of perhaps didn't agree with?
Well, what Plato didn't agree with was all those stories about the gods that where they were fighting each other and eating their children and what else? I mean, all those, you know, stories.
Sacrifice of Iphigenia.
Say it again.
The sacrifice of Iphigenia in order to start the war in Troy. You know, Agamemnon had to sacrifice. So the god was demanding a human sacrifice. Yeah, which is.
On the other hand, Athena intervened in the trials of
Odysseus.
Yeah, no, it's gone. But Athena intervened in the trials and sent and cast the stone of you know, doubt, where there's reasonable doubt.
Yeah. Okay. So what he was looking for was a very clear kind of propaganda with giving a message of good behavior and bad behavior and orientating people towards a good and just society. And so he looks at these things and sort of says, well, they're not necessarily doing that, and they're giving bad role models for the kiddies. And so it's that sort of argument. So let's set up a new set of myth, and let's also educate the elite, just to educate the elite in the mathematical sciences and dialectic and in modes of inquiry and everything. So that's what he's trying to do. Yep.
Or write about the predominant, the Athenian citizens and the rulers, the auxiliaries, and the tradies or businessmen. In the Republic, did Plato have a, I mean, were the Medici, the non-Athenian citizens included, and what about the slaves? And we get, I think, a little bit about women. He wanted the women to receive the education, because he was feeling that it was absurd that half the population was not being educated. Having said that, the men were doing it better anyway. But what about the slaves? Did the Republic still have slaves?
There's not much mention of slavery, but as I recall, I think there are a couple of mentions as an aside, like the way you treat slaves. So I wouldn't be surprised if it was presumed that there were still slaves. Yeah. I'll have to think about that one and go and have a look. But in terms of women, basically the argument was, look, the only difference that you can see, you should discriminate between men and women in terms of roles, is where it relates to their differences, so their reproductive differences. So they're involved in reproduction, then obviously they treat it differently, but otherwise they're not. And so as we will move on, we will see that discussions all about this elite. And so they live in barracks, and they have they don't have family. The family is broken down. So you don't have a wife or a husband necessarily. In fact, you may not even know who your biological parent is. And the children are brought up in common. And there's a bit of a contradiction in the way he talks, because he talks about, he says that women are in common possession of all the men. So you think, well, hang on a sec, they're not really equal. So there's often that contradiction in his writing. He hasn't really thought it all through. He's still thinking that women are the possession of men. But yeah, so that's, did I answer that question? That's all breaks down.
What does that mean, in possession of men?
Of all men. So women in our society as well used to be the chattels of men, right? So they were the possessions of men.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Possessions.
In this case, the men ruled the family, and they had their wife and their children who they were in authority over. And what they're saying here is that whole structure of the family is destroyed in the Guardians. So he wants to move it away from that.
Because of attachment, or why? I mean, I know that he was an admirer of the Spartan society, and everyone was an admirer, but no one wanted to live like a Spartan at the same time. And yeah, barracks was really very central in the life. But yeah,
I think there's a few reasons, but one of the main reasons is that he wanted to break down that element of the politics where families are competing against each other and so forth, and he just wanted to bring it out that meritocratic in terms of the philosophers who educated and were educated and did well at their studies, they would rise to the top. And family favoritism and family allegiances and all that sort of thing, because of course old Athens was very much about the big families, their influences. He wanted to break all that down, and the tribes as well. He wanted to break all that down so that all the focus was on the good of the society.
I found myself wondering whether he tried to be a little diplomatic as well. So based on his starting point and the society that existed at the time, was he trying to take him one or two steps forward rather than, get him to change completely?
Well, I think so. I mean, you've just really got to, it's hard for us to think about it with all the history that's gone since and all the discussion about political systems. You've got to think about what he was brought up with And, you know, like you could say that even his ideas about the role of women in society were quite radical thinking, because perhaps other people didn't even consider that would be possible. So we do need to think that way. Now, Effie, I'm just realizing we're coming up to time. I'm just wondering, guys, if like we just round off here, and we can, because we covered so much today, and I put too much in it, I'm sorry about that, but we really needed to summarize that first 4 books. So maybe we can cut off here and we can do both readings next week. I don't think that will be a problem if everyone's okay about that.
Yep.
Yep,
Okay.
that's
Yeah,
fine.
okay.
Thank you.
Fine.
Yeah.
Okay, so did anyone have any last things we'll just finish up. And if you do need to, well, maybe I'll say goodbye. And if you do need to leave, just wave goodbye and drop out. So thanks for coming. And I hope to see you guys next Monday night. And I'm so glad the technology worked. And if you've got any feedback about the way it's running, I've never done a Zoom before, so if you've got any feedback, I would really love to hear it. That'd be great.
That's my feedback.
Okay, great. All right, so did anyone else have something to say about this organizations of society and the family and all that sort of thing?
No, perhaps next, after we've read through again,
Yeah.
maybe we'll have something to say, maybe too much to say.
It's quite interesting, because in some cases it is presented as, especially with, I suppose, relevant to justice, that you know, you shouldn't have movement between those 3 classes. Otherwise, you will end up in anarchy and chaos, and it will be the destruction of society. So yes, quite interesting actually.
It's quite rigid. He does allow for movement in the society. One of the noble lies that he wants to tell is this, I don't know whether you've heard about it, gold, silver and bronze people. So a myth that there's gold and silver and bronze people. And so he would say that very much a class society. So the gold people, the ruling class, would have gold parents, and generally speaking, and bronze people would have bronze parents. And there would be some movement between the classes. Like he would explain that, you know, in this dogma, that sometimes a bronze person has a gold child. So the kind of rulers say, oh, you know, this person looks good, we'll lift him up into the ruling class, that sort of thing. So, but generally speaking, it was very much, the image he presents is very much the guardians, the auxiliaries, and then the tradespeople. That's pretty much it. Rigid structure. How are you going, Con? Haven't heard from you yet.
Good. I was going to ask you, I sometimes hear the word Phaedrus. Is that like Phaedo? Is that?
Phaedrus.
No,
Different.
Phaedrus is another dialogue. Phaedrus is the dialogue about rhetoric and love that we will be discussing in another group in the spring. Yeah.
So it's different from Phaedo.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It is. So the Phaedo is quite long dialogue, which is the lead up to Socrates taking the hemlock. Yeah, that's the quite famous one where it's the last day in the prison, but the Phaedrus, I've got it right, is the one that ostensibly is about love and also about rhetoric and writing and things like that. It's very interesting dialogue. Yeah.
Thank you.
Anyone else? All right.
Thank you, Bernie.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bernie.
If anyone wants to hang around and chat, that's okay too. So I'll just leave it on, and we'll just see you. Otherwise, see you next Monday. It's great, and do your reading. And
Oh,
Thank you.
bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Maybe.
No.
okay, everyone's turning off.
It's very, very interesting. I mean, I don't want to leave.
Yeah. What did you find interesting?
So maybe you shouldn't encourage this. It's even at the beginning of the reading that we were supposed to be doing, like the knowledge and the different types of knowledge and yeah, the wisdom and the four virtues and everything, and it's fascinating, and you can see that I was actually, I found it prophetic in some case. I don't know whether I'm using the right word. How when he's talking about the different political regimes, the teamarchy and oligarchy and all that, and then he goes, oh, but you can have corruption and you can have this, and then you can become a tyrant, and you know something, it was Trump. The image of Trump popped in front of me, and I'm saying, well, hang on, this is exactly what's happening. You know, you're supposed to have democracy, and then things go wrong.
Hang on, Maria, you're
reading
ahead. You're reading ahead, right? You're reading ahead.
Well, I try. As I said, I tried to do some reading, and I like going to the ancient text a little bit as well, with some of them. Nomenclature, like I can get them the gist a little bit better when I have the Greek word. But yeah, no, this was that.
I had the same feeling reading about that was book 9, where he's reading about how democracy evolves into tyranny, and it sent a shiver down my spine. It just felt so so insightful and so pertinent to the current situation. How did you go, Con?
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, look, I'm gonna just take it slowly. I'm not gonna put too much pressure on myself. Yeah, I'm gonna just take it slowly, read it, maybe read it again. You know, read the chapters that you tell us to read, I might have to read it twice. I'm a person that needs to read something more than once.
Oh yeah, it's very hard.
Yeah.
I can't. It won't sink in the first time.
What I do often say is have a go at reading it, and you'll probably fail before the class. No, I'm serious. Same with myself. And then we have the chat about it, and then I have another go reading after the class. And it's often that second reading that you can get into it a bit more. Yeah.
No, I really like the introduction, and I'm looking forward to the next 5-6 weeks.
Okay, mate.
Yes, thank you very much, actually, for the introduction of the previous books. It's
you appreciate that?
Yes, very much. It put things into perspective. Yeah.
Oh well, Maria, that doesn't make you feel so bad about running out of time.
No.
Yeah, it'll be okay. It'll really be okay, because we had to cover so much today, and we'll have no problem next week.
Yeah,
so we'll be fine. Yeah.
Okay.
Right, guys, I might let you go.
Good night.
See ya.
Good night, Con. Bye.
Bye.
Yes, I was going to ask. I can be 2 more minutes if you want. Yeah, I know you're busy. I don't want to. Yeah, basically, yeah, look, I'm looking forward to the course, and yeah, now, I've been teaching for 20 years, Bernie, and I don't know if you know, but classical education is very big in America.
Mm-hmm.
It's a big movement there, and I sometimes look at Australia and look, it might not happen in my lifetime, Bernie, but yeah, look, I've met 4 teachers in Melbourne, and like you know, they're exploring it. I'm still exploring this idea of classical education. But I like your course where you talked about the maps, you know, the Platonic, the Plato and his maps. I read that course outline, and I know your first session was on the trivium and the quadrivium. I think that was in your, yeah, I read your course outline.
Oh, okay.
For the one that you offer on maths.
On what, sorry?
Maths, mathematics.
Mathematics. Oh, yeah.
The first session was on the trivium and the quadrivium, and that's what lit the spark, because that's what the classical education is basically. It's the 7 liberal arts.
Yeah.
But look, thank you for joining our Facebook page, and look, as I said, you know, we have a lot of followers, not just from Melbourne, but you know, a lot of people are interested in this idea from Sydney, from Brisbane. It's not just Victoria, even though we call ourselves Victorian for classical education. It began in Victoria and Melbourne, but we're hoping that this can.
Yeah, the Platonic Academy of Melbourne also has a lot of members and not in Melbourne, so
but look, as I said, I see this as a lifetime journey, Bernie. I haven't given myself like a timeline, like in the next 1 year, 2 years. But I'm just very delighted by what's happening in America. I think I mentioned the Cersei. I don't know if you've ever heard of Cersei and classical AU. In America, they have online courses on what is rhetoric, what is logic.
Yeah.
It costs a lot of money. You know, it's not cheap. It's not a cheap course, but it's. I go, wow. Yeah. But look, that's America. You know, America's a different country. They've got a different education system. They have a lot of classical charter schools. I don't know if you've heard of that. But they have they have a lot of liberal colleges. Yeah, but anyway, look, I can talk. I don't want to talk for hours, but look, I'm looking forward to next Monday, and yeah, look, as I said, I've got my book here.
Yeah.
So yeah, and it's nice to meet you, and I really enjoyed the participants, a nice group of people, and and enjoy your evening, and sorry to take up a few extra moments of your time. Yeah.
No worries. Good to meet you, Con.
Yeah, no worries. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.